Hello there everyone, it is Toby from TIJ Music and welcome to a brand new video. Today, for the first time in a long time, it is time for a new album review. Hot off the press, released today, certainly digitally. I know it's been released on CD as well. On the 21st of August, it is a new Johnny Hates Jazz album. The first album since 2013's Magnetised. And this album is called Wide Awake. Released on their own label, I think, JHJ Music. That's what I understand anyway. There might be another label involved, but by the name of JHJ Music, you would presume that it's their own label. But as I say, it's their first release since 2013's Magnetised, and only the second release of this current band lineup. It's only a duo these days rather than the trio that there was back in the day of Turn Back the Clock, with the original lineup of Clark Datchler, Mark Nocito and Calvin Hayes. Phil Fornelli, of course, replaced Clark Datchler for the second album, which was Tall Stories, and of course that didn't perform too well because of a few things that happened before the album, but that's a decent album as well. Of course, I got into Johnny Hates Jazz, like a lot of people probably would, through that 1988 album, and my opinion is it's one of the best albums of the 1980s. Some people don't agree with me, but I certainly do. It is an album full of classic tracks. Wasn't quite followed up with Tall Stories, but Magnetised, from what I've heard of Magnetised, it was a decent album. I haven't heard all the album, admittedly. I think I've probably heard 3 or 4 tracks, but with what I've heard, it's pretty good. So when I heard that this new album was coming out, I thought, yeah, I'll definitely give this a try, and I've been quite positively surprised with it. I think that the trouble is these days with these old bands, we expect a little bit too much from them. We expect them to sound exactly like a replica of Turn Back the Clock in this instance, and that would be very harsh to do because it ain't going to sound like that. Music's changed in the 32 years since Turn Back the Clock. And it's a different sound. It's maybe not a sound that I'm too fond of too much, and I'm grappling and trying to keep with that older sound, but it's actually a sound that's pretty decent, and I'm actually, as I say, quite positively surprised. I think we expect so much of these new releases that actually we don't expect anything, if that makes any sense at all. I hope it does. But yeah, I've been very positively surprised, and it's no secret, Clark Datchler said, I think in an interview, that they wanted to move away from the sophisti-pop, as it was called back in 1988, of Turn Back the Clock, and wants to write tracks that were more socially conscious, with more of a meaning, and it's seen here definitely with themes of climate change, and there's other social commentary throughout the album. And what's nice about this album is that it combines elements of soul, funk, pop, rock, and that's quite refreshing to see, actually, a nice mixture of that, and Johnny Hates Jazz say themselves, I don't know if this was Clark, Mike or whoever, but it was on their website, that this album is a mixture of soulful melodies, uplifting lyrics, and a positive energy that is present from start to finish. Well, I can't disagree with that too much. Of course, the lyrics here come from Clark Datchler. There are contributions, of course, from Mike, who plays bass, engineers, and does all the instrumental type things, but Clark's a brilliant vocalist, and Mike adds a lot to the pot as well. And there's also contributions from Phil Fornelli, who wrote the track Listen from the first, I'm sure it was Listen, and I think he contributed on Foolish Heart as well from that first album, and obviously was the vocalist then on the second album, Tall Stories. He certainly contributes on the first track, Spirit of Love, but I couldn't quite get a full track listing with who wrote each individual track, so I'm guessing Clark writes most of the lyrical content, but if I'm wrong, feel free to dispute that down in the comments. I've got no problem with that. Right, let's get cracking. Let's have a look at the 9 tracks that make up this album. Just comes in at over 30 minutes, so quite a short album really for what you'd be used to, but comes in about 32 minutes, 9 tracks. I think the longest is, I want to say No Mistakes, at exactly 4 minutes in length, but apart from that, all the tracks are below 4 minutes in length, which really isn't too much of a problem. So let's look at the first track. So this was the first single from the album, Spirit of Love, which, it has to be said, is a nice sounding polished track, and it's the first single from the album, as I've just said. It was released quite a while ago, and I'd listened to it once or twice, but that was a long time ago, and listened to it again with the album. And it's almost got that 70s soul feel, I think, and it's very catchy, very radio-friendly, and straight from the outset, they put out what they want to do and prove that they're back. And they sound good. It's very indicative, I always think, from this first song of albums, particularly nowadays with these older bands, to know what you're going to expect. If the first song's quite poor, then you expect a bit of a rocky ride, but this is a good track and sets the album up quite well. So I'm going to give this one a 7 out of 10. It's a good track, and it's very radio friendly, I have to say. Now, the second single from the album, I don't think it was an official single. It's certainly not listed as put your teeth back in, as an official single on their website, but it was released on Spotify on the 5th of August, so I guess it's a single. whether you agree with that or not. But the song is New Day Ahead. Now, I listened to this for the first time, and I was a bit indifferent to it. But as I've listened to it more and more, I actually quite enjoy it. The band have said that apparently this is a mix of David Attenborough and Sweet. Of course, the Sweet, the glam rock band from the 70s. And I'm not quite sure about that. I think that was a bit of tongue-in-cheek, but it's certainly a good track. This is very much a track which looks at social commentary and looks at the subject of climate change, which this is definitely the strongest track of the socially conscious ones on this album, because it's made pretty explicit. This is about climate change. But I'm really a fan of that chorus. All you girls and all you boys, turn up the volume, make some noise because there's a new day ahead. There's a real groove to this track. And I didn't like it at first, but I've really grown to love this track, and that's why I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. Again, it's quite catchy, polished like its predecessor, but it's got a lot more groove than the previous track, so that's why it gets an 8 out of 10, and it's gone straight into my playlist. I quite like it. So we now move on to track number 3, and this was a bit of a disappointment, to be quite honest. I've read a few reviews which rate this quite highly, but I don't really think it moves anywhere. This track is Love the Light, and another one that's fairly socially conscious, with lyrics such as... Where's the lyrics? I didn't actually put any lyrics on this one. I think the lyrics for this one is something along the lines of basically all the rich people taking advantage of the vulnerable and all that sort of thing. So it's very socially conscious again, but for me, it doesn't really move anywhere. It's a tad bland, and I think it's one of the weaker tracks on the album, unfortunately. There's 2 fairly short verses and 2 choruses, so it's a little disappointing, but there's a nice harmonica in the mid-section which pushes the track up slightly, but again, it's not one I'm going to add to my playlist. It's probably one that I'm not really going to listen to too much unless I really grow into it. So this one for me only gets a 5 out of 10. You know, I've got to rank the tracks, and this is how the album reviews are very tricky when it comes to ranking the tracks and ranking it out of 10, because 10 is a track which is absolutely fantastic, one of the best of all time, and it's very tricky for tracks to get a 10. That's why even some of the best tracks that I say are brilliant only get a 9, because it's almost like a lot of things in life. To categorise something as the best, it has to be the best, and if you categorise everything as the best, well, then there's no... Anyway, yeah, there's no point me rambling about that for too long, but this one only gets a 5 out of 10. A little bit disappointing, I have to say. So we move on to the 4th track, which is called Greater Good, and it unfortunately continues in a bit of a similar vein to the previous track, although this one is a little bit better. It's a bit more of a poppy track, and it's a little bit non-moving, but it does the pop thing pretty well. So I'm going to give this one a bit of a 6 out of 10. Again, it's another bit of a throwaway track, and it's what disappoints me a little bit in the album, that the guys said, well, this isn't really a pop album, it's more socially conscious, a lot deeper, and as somebody who likes deeper music, I was like, oh, great, I'm really looking forward to this. And the first 2 tracks really encapsulates that really well. But these 2 tracks, I think, are the weakest on the album, but not to say that Greater Good isn't a decent song, so this one gets a 6 out of 10. But the good news is, after these 2 tracks, we then move to the highlight of the album, the title track, Wide Awake. I'm going to give this another 8 out of 10. This is a brilliant, brilliant track. Just a shame that it's confined to an album track rather than a single. It's got a great funky feel with the guitar and the drums that flow through the track, and Datchler, I think this is probably one of his best vocal performances of the album. His voice actually has aged really well. You get a lot of vocalists that, I mean, it's been a long time, hasn't it, since Turn Back the Clock, 32 years. I think he's late 50s, I want to say now. Surely he's got to be. 32 years ago, maybe early 20s, so he's got to be at least 55 or something like that. So fair dues to him. But there's plenty of groove here, and it's pretty similar to the 1988 release and some of the tracks on that. And there's a bit of sax in there as well, so any track that's got saxophone in it gets a thumbs up from me. So a really good track. If I was to recommend any track from this album to go and check out, that one would be the one to start with. So we now move on to track 6. I think that these 4 tracks make up side 2. I'm not too sure, I don't know how it works, but there's no vinyl of the album. I know that they've very much set it out as a side 1, side 2, but then there's no LP. Yeah, make of that what you will. But the 6th track on the album is simply called Free. I'm going to give this one a 7 out of 10. It's another poppy track, and at the start of this track I thought, this isn't really going anywhere, but I have to say, it does grow in stature a little bit throughout. Some good groove in this, some good lyrical content, and I read a review somewhere, and I've read a few reviews in preparation for this, just to see what other people think of the album, not necessarily to influence my view, but I did read a comment that this was described as BBC Radio 2 fodder. That's just unfair. It's not fantastic, but it's good. It's not that bad at all. Track number 7, and funnily enough, this gets another 7. It gets to the point of the album where from this point, there aren't any new tracks that are groundbreaking. There are only tracks that I'll go, wow, these are fantastic. But pretty well until the end of the album, there's a good consistent feel, and that's certainly nice. Not every track has to be groundbreaking and brilliant, but you know, there's certainly some consistency on the second half of the album, which is much appreciated. I mean, track 3 and 4, yeah, they're not great, track 3 and 4, but toward the end of the album, we are pretty consistent now. So, No Mistakes is the 7th track, another good track, and there's silky smooth vocals through this ballad, and they sound really nice. Again, it's a consistent track, nothing special, but it just sounds good, and that's the main thing. You know, a lot of these albums now have got a bit too much auto-tune. They sound a bit too polished, and although some of the tracks on this album sound polished, they don't sound too polished, and this is a perfect example of that. Some really nice vocals, and it sounds really pure, and that's a real credit to this album and the vocals of Datchler at this point. So now for the penultimate track, again another 7 out of 10, another good track, and that's called Don't Stop the Music. Plenty of groove here once again. I didn't like this one when I first listened to it. I thought, oh god, are they going to go all poppy and disco? But actually, it's not too bad at all. It's better than I thought, certainly, when I reappraised this track. Now, it's not the most groundbreaking idea in terms of lyrical content. It's a little bit disco influenced, but it's a good track, and as I said earlier, it flows well in the sense of the album, which is really important. So that's been pretty quick, actually. We get to the final track on this album, which is called My Old Piano, and this, compared to the previous tracks, is a little bit disappointing, actually. It's only a 6 out of 10 from me. It's, yeah, a little bit non-moving, and I guess it's a nice ending to the album because it slows things down a little bit, but for me, this one's a decent track. Nothing more and nothing less, really, but the album, really, all the tracks, I think apart from Love the Light, are good, listenable tracks. I may have been a little bit harsh on the third track there, possibly, but again, I'm not a fan of it. But apart from that, it's a good, enjoyable listen, and that's really all that matters. So what I do on all these album reviews is I take a rating, an average rating of all 9 tracks, or as many tracks as there might be on the album, and then deliver a verdict. So this comes out at 6.8 out of 10, officially 6.77, but we'll round it up a little bit. 6.8 out of 10, which is 3 1/4 stars, I suppose you could say. No, it's 3.5 stars, isn't it, with 7? Yeah, so it's 3 and how many stars? But yeah, I think that's a fair reflection of the album. It's fairly consistent. I think if you stop trying to compare to their earlier output, you get a good album. I think that the problem was certainly what I've done in the past with bands. I've gone, right, this is a new album. I want this to sound just like this album. And it doesn't. And I'm like, oh, right, I wasn't expecting that. But here, as I say, it's quite a positive surprise. Some great individual tracks, the likes of Wide Awake, New Day Ahead, even the likes of Spirit of Love are good tracks. It's let down a little by some of the blander tracks. Again, Love the Light, Greater Good, and My Old Piano. But apart from Love the Light, I know I'm being too harsh on that track. But they're still decent tracks. They're let down because they're not as good as the high standard that they're setting on these other tracks, but they're still listenable and decent tracks. But as I said earlier, it's a good listen and an enjoyable listen, a good effort on the most part, and the guys sound really great, so that's a real credit to those guys after so many years. And one comment before we finish is that the last album, Magnetised, only went to 102 in the UK charts. Surely this one can do a little bit better. And that's where we're going to end today's review. So if you enjoyed that review of this new album, make sure to leave a thumbs up down below. Leave your thoughts of the album. And if you haven't listened to this album yet, it's available on Spotify, all streaming services. And of course, you can buy a physical copy. I haven't got round to doing that yet. I might well buy a physical copy. I knew the album was coming out. For some reason, I didn't pre-order it. And I do regret that a little bit now. But if it comes up a little bit later on, I might well buy it. But certainly a good album. Again, go out and listen to it. Go and support the band. And hopefully we can get this album to a good place on the UK album charts. But yeah, a good album, 6.8 out of 10. I hope you guys have enjoyed today's review. I've got plenty of other reviews on the channel. No other Johnny Hates Jazz content just yet, but I am planning to rectify that with a review of the first album pretty surely. Anyway, thank you for watching. I've been TIJ Music, and I'll see you all later on. Goodbye for now.